In the interest of time, I'll try to go through it at a high level and focus on things that are sort of signature initiatives or goals, or that you may be interested in particular. Housing New York is Mayor de Blasio's five-borough, 10-year housing plan for New York City to build 200,000 affordable housing units. And what's particularly exciting about the plan is that it looks beyond simply that unit count at other affordable housing goals, such as housing quality in New York, expanding the availability of affordable housing to a wider range of income groups than are typically served by affordable housing. And finally, looking at fostering vibrant neighborhoods, which is a critical component of any housing agenda. A little bit about how the plan came to be. It was an effort that I think was unprecedented in how collaborative it was in soliciting input and shaping the goals and initiatives. The city convened over 200 stakeholders that were advocates, housing and affordable housing developers and service providers, labor representatives, and elected officials, as well as convening staff and leadership from 13 city agencies, which in part reflects the administration's desire to get the best and brightest ideas wherever they may come from, and also that this is a really ambitious plan. We face significant challenges, and we need all hands on deck to achieve our goals. A bit of background about what's shaping the crisis and what sort of issues we're responding to in our work. Some of the key drivers of the affordability crisis in New York are that over the past 10 years, rents have raised on average, but the renters' wages have remained relatively flat. And in part as a result of this, over half of New York renter households are rent burdened, which is defined as paying more than 30% of their gross income towards rent. And 30% are extremely rent burdened, which is defined as paying more than half of gross income towards rent. On the supply side, there has, for a variety of reasons, which I'll discuss a little bit more later, there hasn't been enough new housing construction, and particularly affordable housing construction. There's about, for every 2 extremely low income and very low income households, there's only 1 unit affordable to them in New York City. On the demand side, after a period of population decline, New York has been experiencing population growth over the last decade or so, and as it becomes a more and more desirable place to live, and that growth is expected over the coming decades. This is a graph that represents rents and incomes. As you can see, as a result of the Great Recession, renter income declined fairly significantly, while during that period, rental costs continue to increase. This is a chart showing the growth in the number of rent-burdened and extremely rent-burdened households. And here you can see this is a chart representing housing supply. Building permits and certificates of occupancy sort of increased in the run-up to the collapse of the real estate market and the economy. And while there's been some recovery, they're still significantly lower than they were during the boom times of the last decade. Here you see that there's fewer than 500,000 units that are affordable to extremely low income and very low income households, while there are approximately 1 million of those households that are in need of those units. And this is a depiction of the population growth, both that we've experienced and that we project from now through 2040. So turning to the plan was guided by these 8 key principles. The first that I touched on earlier, that we expand who we serve, and that we also focus more on supplying units that are appropriate to the changing demographics of the city. We're also seeking to better use our land use policies and processes to enable growth and enable density where appropriate, and in doing that, to make sure that we engage communities and that communities have a chance to voice and shape their own neighborhood development. The plan acknowledges the critical value of economic diversity in housing and in neighborhood development, and that the city needs to devote all of its tools and assets effectively towards housing production and preservation. The number 5 is that it acknowledges that the city has invested billions of dollars over the past few decades in affordable housing, leveraging state and federal and private dollars as well, and that it's critical that we preserve those investments for coming generations, and that as neighborhoods change, we also focus on ways to preserve their affordability for their existing residents and for future residents. Of importance to this body, the plan acknowledges the need to stem the tide of deregulation and to protect tenants, expand protections available to tenants. And finally, that we have a particular window right now of high equity raises from tax credits and relatively low interest rates that we need to seize the moment and, whenever possible, leverage favorable markets to increase the production of housing and affordable housing in particular. And that as part of that, the city needs to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak, and increase its own capital commitment to producing housing, which the mayor has done. So here are the key goals of the plan. Each of these represents a chapter. It's a long document, so you might not have been able to read it all, but I'll try to go through it and focus on initiatives that I think might be of interest. First, fostering diverse, livable neighborhoods. This is unique. Housing plans often don't give a lot of attention or time to the importance of the neighborhood in the success of any housing strategy, and this plan does acknowledge that importance. One of the key initiatives here that's gotten a lot of attention and that will be an important part of city policy is the announcement that the city will pursue a mandatory inclusionary housing policy. The plan also talks about ways to better coordinate city agency activity in its investments and capital planning to make sure that as we develop neighborhoods and look for ways to grow neighborhoods and look for opportunities for more density in cities, in New York City, that we also combine those investments in ways that support services, infrastructure, and amenities that are necessary to make a neighborhood successful and vibrant. On the preservation side, I imagine this chapter and set of goals will be of most interest to you. The preservation goals in the plan were both pointed towards affordability and quality of the housing stock. Under sort of the rubric of housing quality, there's a series of initiatives beginning with a comprehensive review of the Housing Maintenance Code, which hasn't happened since its drafting in the 60s. And we also have a series of initiatives on ways that HPD in particular can improve how it enforces the Housing Maintenance Code and how it works with owners and tenants to preserve housing quality. With respect to rent stabilization, the plan explicitly acknowledges the critical importance that the rent stabilized unit stock plays in supporting affordable housing in New York City. And in addition to providing tenant protections to 2.3 million tenants who are living in rent-regulated units, one of the initiatives announced in the plan was acknowledging that I think 30,000 tenants were evicted in the last year, most of whom were unrepresented, a need to increase legal services and representation for tenants in those proceedings to make sure that they're balanced and that the tenant has an opportunity to assert its own rights and defend its rights. And also to prevent situations where an owner may be evicting a tenant in order to move the unit out of rent stabilization. In addition, the city wants to work with owners and tenants in creating more awareness about owner and tenant rights, responsibilities, and resources. And in particular, we'd like to work to create a set of tools for small building owners who often aren't aware of those resources or aren't able to access them and who may need the most assistance. Finally, one thing that's of interest in the plan, this is the last bullet, is that we're currently looking at creating preservation programs that address rising utility costs. by looking for ways that we could improve a building's energy efficiency and utility infrastructure that would help lower the building's operating costs while simultaneously, which is a major threat to preservation of affordability, as you all know, and it would also give us an opportunity to promote sustainability goals and resiliency goals of the city's infrastructure. On the new construction side, in addition to sort of building an unprecedented number of units under this plan, the city's hoping to and planning to serve a wider range of incomes. The affordable housing tools that are available for cities to build new housing are generally have strings attached that make it difficult to finance housing for groups outside of a very narrow band of income in the sort of 50 to 60% area median income range. And so the city in its budget has recently increased subsidy in order to deepen the subsidy that we can provide to reach lower income bands and households. And we're also looking at ways to reach more middle income households. That touches on the guiding principle of economic diversity in housing. It also acknowledges that the affordability crisis is hitting a much larger group of people beyond that narrow band that we're normally able to serve. We're also looking at ways, going back to the guiding principle of using our land use policies more effectively towards promoting housing goals. We're looking at barriers in land use and zoning to affordable housing development that may be unnecessary and that we could reduce and increase our production, such as affordable housing parking requirements that may increase costs and limit space, heightened setback regulations that could be modernized given the way we build and live in housing today. And then finally, we're looking at sort of internal city barriers in our review processes that may cause cost increases or delays. And we're looking at reviewing our own term sheets with our stakeholders to make sure that we're using our own subsidy as effectively as possible. We also, the plan I think is unique in the visibility and the priority that it gives to promoting housing and improving housing for people that may have special needs. This includes the homeless or formerly homeless, seniors, people who need special services, and people with disabilities. In this set of goals, we have initiatives that include what would be very innovative to try to use some shelter funding to finance permanent housing. Shelter funding can often be very expensive, and it can be cheaper in many instances to build and finance permanent housing for the same households. It can be complicated to achieve that, but the city has its best and brightest minds and help from the finance world in thinking through how we can, through things like social impact bonds, how we could divert some shelter funding to permanent housing to sort of better solve this problem. Also possibly of interest to this group, the city and the state have been moving to increase the eligibility for the senior citizen rent increase exemption, the SCREE program. And we're hoping to do that as well for the DRE program, the disability rent increase exemption, to better align the two and to make DRE available to a greater number of New Yorkers who have disabilities. This last section is sort of in support of the previous 4 set of goals. This is increasing the city's toolkit to finance affordable housing development. This includes the city's convening a task force to look at our tax incentives and ways that we could better align those incentives with our subsidy programs and better administer the tax incentive programs to produce more housing and produce it more efficiently. Here also is mentioned where we would look at our own term sheets in our housing development programs to make sure we're stretching our dollar as far as it can go. So that's it. Here, just to sum up, the marquee number is the 200,000 units to be built or preserved over 10 years. The city has proposed an $8.2 billion investment of its own resources to achieve this plan, and it would leverage state, federal, and private money for a total development cost of $41 billion. The breakdown of preservation and new construction is 60% preservation, 40% new construction, and some key changes in policy would be deepening subsidy for extremely low-income units to produce significantly more of them, and also doing the same for moderate-income units. This sort of represents that breakdown graphically, and this is a bit more specifics on what we plan to invest. We're expecting about $3 billion from state and federal funds over the next 10 years, and the majority of the plan will be financed by private funds, which is our business model for building housing. You know, we leverage at over a 3-to-1 ratio our money with private money to cover the total development cost of the housing construction and preservation. We're convening an implementation board to sort of oversee the implementation of these initiatives. There are over 50 initiatives that are listed in the plan, and so the management of that process is going to be resource intensive, and we're going to want as many smart people as we can convene to help guide that. And that's it. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Thank you so much. And two of the questions actually have to do with what was in the material provided as opposed to your presentation. And one question is about the mandatory inclusionary housing. Of course, with the voluntary housing, you get the FAR bonus so that you can maintain the 4-to-1 ratio that's needed to support the market rates. So if you have mandatory, does that mean that rezoning is going to be a part of this to zone?
Yeah, so the mandatory policy would apply in an area that's rezoned to substantially increase housing opportunity in that zone. So if you're converting a zone from a manufacturing zone to a residential zone, then the bonus is essentially all of the new, you have an entirely new set of land that you can develop as housing. It's similar to that in that way.
So it's not going to change any of the area that was rezoned already? Like in Queens, some of the Jamaica area where you could have voluntary inclusionary housing, but it's
the city is, for the mandatory program, the city is, so HPD is working closely with DCP and the law department, and the areas we're looking at would be new rezonings for now.
Okay.
So.
My other question was in the, and this there may not be an answer to, it was about the transferable development rights, that there was mention in the material that the city was going to look to move development rights that were not being used to areas where there was going to be housing. And I was curious as to how that's going to be done. I mean, like you will select the receiving site, and does that need to be adjacent to the donor site the way things are now? Or is it going to be maybe the creation of some sort of a zone and then a transfer from?
So I think we're looking at all options right now. We're at a really early stage of that policy development process. I think what the plan acknowledges is that there's a lot of unused development rights in New York City at a time when we have scarce land and a huge need for housing. So we need to look at how we can most effectively use those development rights to promote housing goals.
And I had a question to which I don't think there is an answer. I know historically where there's been discussion of the use of the brownfields for many things. And what has stopped it heretofore has always been the who's going to assume all of the liability. It's once with the funds, they've gotten past the notion of who's going to pay to clean it up. And you did mention that, not you personally, the material mentioned that OER has the fund. So is there going to be a discussion about assuming responsibility for liabilities?
I would assume that there would need to be a discussion. I don't have any answers on where that liability is going to lie.
Okay. And one last, this is it, I promise. In the presentation, you discussed the fact that they were going to look at what it costs to run a building and to try to find ways to make it more efficient. Is there going to be a discussion about trying to limit those costs before we even get to the building level? For example, some kind of substantial reform of the property tax structure?
I don't think I can speak to any of that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
I want to compliment you and your colleagues on a brilliant report. I think
Thank
it's
you.
forward-thinking. And I do particularly appreciate the quantitative and qualitative aspects, the fusion of it and recognizing that's an important component. It seems like the keystone for this, the success is added density and, sort of growth. And being a Brooklyn resident, and I know that two of the neighborhoods, East New York and I guess Gowanus, are being targeted. Two of them are having community-based plans, and there seem to be somewhat sympathetic to having additional density and growth. But that doesn't seem to be a natural occurrence in most communities. How are you going to bridge that gap? Because that's the keystone. I know, so that's the one thing. And then my second question, you can answer them both at the same time. I know the current capital budget is $41 billion that you cited. What was it under the, just to contextualize it for me, under the new marketplace, under the Bloomberg
It was in the mid-30s, I think.
And what was the Koch
the low
plan?
30s.
Do you have?
I don't know the total development cost of the Koch plan. I think the Koch plan's city commitment was about $5 billion. And so it was a different business model because it didn't leverage private as much. The Koch plan was more about acquiring in-rem properties, and the subsequent plans are more about developing those properties and developing private sites.
And between the new marketplace and the current plan, what was the private component that you said it's 30 billion?
It was in the, so the new marketplace plan, I wish I should have these numbers. I can get these to you very easily. We have a legacy report that covers all this that's on our website. That's the report, came out in December, that I can send to you that has the leverage ratio and the amount of city capital and private capital that were included. I think it was in the low 30s.
And if you can comment on the density and sort of growth.
Yeah,
in
so that's a
all
great
neighborhoods.
question, and I'm not going to be able to give you. I mean, the answer is going to be that the city is going to have very open and frequent dialogue with those communities, and part of the issue is sort of changing the conversation that density doesn't have to mean 20-story towers in every neighborhood. Density can mean moving from 3-story buildings to moving to 6-story buildings, or things that visually and in terms of the character of the neighborhood don't change what people hope their neighborhood will feel like and look like, but that can add substantial capacity for new people. And I mean, it's an issue that everyone understands. Our population is increasing. People want to live here. Everyone feels rent's going up, and we have, our affordability crisis is in part a manifestation of a supply crisis, and we have to address that if we're going to all be able to continue to live here and have it be a vibrant and diverse city.
In the projects that HPD sets rents, can you describe those projects for us if you're able to?
Sorry, do you mean how are rents set in HPD projects?
Well, there are various programs in that HPD supervises the rents, the evictions, basically they are, and these are not just Michelama housing, but other kinds of projects that my understanding is the city does an analysis of the cost to run that building and then determines how much of an increase will be appropriate for the tenants that live there. Many of those tenants are subsidized, but to the extent that they have middle income residents, how is it that HPD determines the rents in those
So
sorts of...
I think this gets at your question. Well, first of all, virtually all of our units enter rent stabilization. That's part of the requirement of receiving our subsidy. So they're governed by those rules, and the tenants receive those protections. In addition, we have a regulatory agreement that we record on the deed of the property, and that every regulatory agreement is negotiated with every developer, but that sets out the terms of both our subsidy and the requirement, the rental requirements, the eligibility requirements for subsidized units. So if we were to be involved in the asset management of the property, it would be pursuant to the regulatory agreement with the owner.
And in the housing plan that's being proposed, there's one criteria that obviously is to ensure that housing production is sustainable. But I'll be honest with you, I haven't read the whole report.
It's okay, it's
But
long. Take to the beach.
Has there been an effort to quantify how to bridge that gap between low-income communities that this housing is going to be targeted for, or middle-income communities that may not be able to pay the rents that are necessary in order to sustain the housing?
So, I'm sorry, do you mean, when I heard sustainable, I thought you meant sort of environmentally sustainable?
No,
You mean
I'm talking
financially
about
sustainable?
financially sustainable.
And you're asking how?
Does the report go into, more the nitty-gritty? How are you going to be able to bridge that gap?
Well, typically, when we're financing a preservation project or a new construction project, we negotiate with the developers about rent levels, the income ranges, unit counts, and subsidy amounts. And we look at the underwriting of the project, and through a process of negotiation with the lead lenders and the developer, we come to an agreement about what the project can sustain over a period of time.
And is there ever an understanding that the rents will increase over time?
Almost always, yeah. I mean, and as part of our asset management process, occasionally we look at places where owners are not doing that appropriately, and then are limiting their ability to maintain the property. But we, as you do, we have to balance that with the needs of the tenants who have, as the chart indicated, who have, flat incomes
Right.
and need for stability.
Right, and then there the government in many cases steps in with subsidies to assist those individuals, correct?
Well, we have HPD and NYCHA run Section 8 programs, so that's one way that we subsidize tenants.
But zero increases are certainly not part of the calculation in this plan,
We're not.
or with any developer.
I mean, as I said, we negotiate the rent levels with every developer on a case-by-case basis. So we don't have a policy one way or the other on that.
Oh, has there ever been a project where there's been a zero increase over time?
I don't know. I'd have to look into that.
Thank you.
Sort of on the new construction, are any of those new construction permanently affordable to the ranges that you set out in the guidelines?
They are. Some of our programs also on a negotiated basis would be permanently affordable. All construction in inclusionary housing, be it voluntary or mandatory, is permanently affordable.
And how many of those units of the 200,000 do you think are permanently affordable?
That I can't answer. I mean, that depends on assumptions that are very high level at this point about how much will be produced, both in the voluntary and the new mandatory program. And then any, typically we have, in sort of large scale, heavily subsidized sites will have some permanently affordable housing, and I don't know that pipeline.
And how about for the sort of preservation portion of it? How many, other than, I understand that there are a lot of tax breaks and incentives for landlords to sort of preserve, make repairs and all of these things. Other than that, what other sort of on the tenant side programs are you thinking to continue to preserve the affordable housing we currently have, or to stay affordable for the tenants?
Our most essential tool and the best tool we have is the Section 8 program, and the Section 8 program was wounded severely by the sequestration and before that by freezes in federal discretionary funding. So it's an essential part of our legislative agenda to continue to advocate for restoring the Section 8 program and expanding the Section 8 program. That's the best tool.
But that money there's no way of you really assuming that money will be provided for you to continue to preserve the affordable housing we currently have at the 60% level without maybe more money for Section 8? Because Section 8, from my understanding, it's, unless you're Mitchell Almer and is transferring for HPD Section 8, or you're on a wait list of who knows how long. I think they're actually not taking applications currently for Section 8 federally. Then how How is that
The
subsidy?
preservation happens through the ways you described, primarily through tax incentives and loan programs that we have, where we perform some kind of, we finance the repair of a building to improve its quality, and in exchange, we require the owner to extend the affordability of the units.
So it's an incentive towards the landlord to continue to preserve by somehow getting benefits of, some kind of loan or tax abatement.
Well, the benefits to the tenant as well. I mean, the tenant is able to, the tenant's rents might otherwise be increased if we didn't attach a new regulatory agreement, which we do when we have a preservation law.
If you make a repair to a building, assume the investment sort of increases for you.
No, when you make a subsidized repair, you're doing that in exchange for preserving affordability.
Hi, just a couple of quick questions and
Sure.
one or two comments. Just on the mandatory inclusionary zoning, I appreciate the step forward in talking about mandatory inclusionary zoning, but I would encourage the administration to think more broadly about this. There are many cities and states around the country which have a mandatory inclusionary zoning program. That's a flat program. You can go to cities, San Diego, San Francisco, resident across the board, low number of units. If we really wanted to talk about permanent affordability and production of units, a mandatory inclusionary program that was citywide, not just in upzoning neighborhoods, could really effectuate a huge number of units. So I know that's not what's in the plan, but I would encourage you and the administration be thinking about that as you move forward, because I do feel like if we're only focusing on those neighborhoods that are upzoned, and in those neighborhoods that are upzoned, we've already rezoned 40% of our city in the last 10 years, so it really narrows the opportunities. Some neighborhoods are going to get downzoned, some neighborhoods are going to get flat zoned, so you're really only then going to put the units in certain communities, and it's really going to isolate the number of affordable units in those communities. And if the plan is true that you want to talk about neighborhoods, that in and of itself isn't going to get you there. But that's just my soapbox for a second. But so I do a couple of questions and maybe a comment about the issue you've raised about permanent affordability. And there's this, the opportunity for with your tax liens and ERP liens to take those units, especially in developments that are properties that are owned by predatory equity companies or private equity companies, when those buildings are going into foreclosure and receivership. There are huge opportunities to recapture those units, and the city could waive their ERP loans or their taxes in exchange for long-term affordability. I'm wondering why that isn't in the plan and the opportunities, because there are lots of opportunities to do that.
It is in the plan. When we were looking at ways to use ERP loans and AEP liens, ERP liens, and also third-party transfer rounds, one of which is overdue, and in which the plan mentions that we hope to initiate that process of going through a tax lien sale process and using that to as a pipeline for affordability. Absolutely.
So you're open, because I worked on a project in the Bronx where we had the same situation where we went to HPD and said, this is a plan, we have a nonprofit developer interested in taking over the property, you see if the building's in foreclosure, can we do this? And HPD wouldn't at the time. And so I'm happy to hear that you're open to doing that now, because that is one way to maintain affordability. I'm wondering what your thought about how NYCHA's open space is going to play into this, and what percentage of these units are going to be built on NYCHA property based on your plan?
I can't really speak to NYCHA. I mean, it would be inappropriate, I think, for me to speak to NYCHA, but it's definitely part of the plan that we intend to work closely with NYCHA tenants and with management to look at available land and development rights at NYCHA, both in terms of creating units and also better integrating and providing services to those campuses with the neighborhoods around them.
You also mentioned that preservation is going to be a key component, and stopping the bleeding of rent-regulated units out of the system. I'm wondering specifically what the administration plans to do, because I did notice in the plan you didn't propose ending high rent vacancy deregulation, decontrol. So I'm wondering, if that's not in the plan, how do you plan to propose the loss of, stemming the tide of loss of units?
Well, I mean, the plan does say that it acknowledges the importance of rent stabilization in preserving affordability and lay out that the city would like to gain greater control over that,
Right.
Over that rulemaking process, which could speak to that. I mean, the way we preserve it is the way we preserve any unit, really. We negotiate with owners to find ways to finance preservation through rehabilitation that comes with extended affordability, or a tax incentive that comes with extended affordability, through that toolkit.
I mean, just to respond, I mean, we lost 7,000 units this year alone. Even though we got 8,000, those 8,000 units those units are renting at $3,400 a month. Those are not affordable units, right? So the 7,000 we lost were the affordable units. So even if you were going to build at that level, which doesn't seem like you are, we're still going to lose more affordable units, even if we get more units in the system. Through 421A, those units are going to be at a much higher rent and not affordable for the people who are in the income bands. So it does seem like a critical piece was the high rent deregulation units, which is where we're seeing the bulk of the units being lost. So I'm wondering, whether the administration was considering that position.
Well, we're definitely looking at new tools that we don't currently have that would give us more flexibility to approach those owners in those situations who are looking at exiting rent stabilization, but who have capital needs and that aren't served by our existing toolkit. So looking at new tools that would allow us to negotiate better with those owners.
And the last question, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add to that because I think that when we speak about preservation, we should really start thinking about rent stabilization in a different way, just because alone in the Community Board 4, where we work in the Bronx as CASA, we used to be so proud to say 83% of our housing was rent stabilized, and that has gone down to 75% in the last year, a couple of years. So I think that's just data that the Furman Center sort of issued recently, and I think that that's really integral in this conversation, because if that's happening in the Bronx, where we're not seeing these high turnover vacancies, we could imagine what's happening in Brooklyn and Queens and in Manhattan, right? And so I think that just speaks to the urgency of really thinking about rent stabilization as not being the 3,400 rents, because the people in the Bronx can't afford that.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things the plan does acknowledge is that every neighborhood is facing a different set of preservation challenges, and what we'd like to do is move from being more reactive, where we're reacting to requests from owners who are looking to extend affordability in exchange for some kind of subsidy. And we want to have a more proactive, strategic, neighborhood-based approach to preservation, which involves using data like that produced by the Furman Center.
So this is my last question, just on when you're figuring out rent increases in the future for when you're working with an owner, so you're looking at what their net operating income is to determine what kind of increases they're entitled to? Is that how you assess what increases that should be eligible for over periods of time?
I'd have to refer that to the asset management group.
Okay.
I think as I said, they would look at anything that they would do with the owner would be pursuant to the regulatory agreement,
Right.
And pursuant to rent stabilization.
I guess logically speaking, if owners are doing better, maybe they need less increases. If owners are doing worse, they need bigger increases based on income flow.
I love you, Harvey. May I go next? First of all, sorry, this has nothing to do with you, but just to clarify, the 7,000 units that were lost and how that was in the low end of the band, and therefore the 8,000, which I thought was a positive sign to see that there wasn't this tide of loss of rent stabilized units, as sort of the nomenclature would say. Again, the state level mandates how that deregulation or destabilization occurs. And so I don't think that it's actually from the low end, just the function of the vacancy deregulation says that is actually those units were on the cusp of turning anyway. Those weren't the Section 8, this wasn't the low end of the income pool. And I just want to just be careful about sort of making blanket statements that like 8,000 of high income units were added to the rent stabilization pool and 7,000 low income rent stabilized, because that's actually mathematically that's almost impossible.
But actually, can I just say something, Sarah? Because I respect your opinion on this, but I fundamentally believe that's true. And I see it in the neighborhood I live. I see it in the work we do. When a rent at $700 it's gone, then the next rent, it gets deregulated and it goes above $2,500. I see it every single day. So my assessment is that those 7,000 units were low rent units, and what we're getting is 8,000 units that are above $2,500, and even they're regulated, they're not to the population we're trying to serve.
But you're talking about a delta.
I recommend that we have this discussion after we've asked
Okay.
questions.
All right. We'll take it up. Question for, first of all, statement, comment that I was very excited to see that you guys had engaged a number of stakeholders for the development of this plan. 13 agencies, and then a number of private sector stakeholders too. I think that was probably one of the brilliant aspects of this plan, was that it had a collaborative voice. This round table, I was trying to figure out what you called it. There's a continued
An
group,
advisory council?
advisory council. Who's going to make up that advisory council?
I think I'd have to ask City Hall for that full list. I think they're still working on that.
Okay.
But it'll be, again, as the plan's drafting was, we intend it to be as open and representative of all the stakeholders in the process as possible.
Might I ask that that the administration considers also including, keeping the, to take a step back. I think about this in terms of sort of the livability of our city. And it's not just tenant owner, it's all the factors that contribute to the livability and the workability of New York City. And I was really happy to see that finance was on that committee. There's also the utility agencies that can be represented there, the schools to be voted, all the things that make up how we live here. And as you're doing your demand and supply analysis, I think that demand isn't just the person, it's also the quality of life for those people. So that's just my 5 cents on if you can
Absolutely,
continue to
and I
have
think
that engagement on all of the stakeholders that impact the quality of life for all the entire population.
I agree, and I think that was part of the purpose of the emphasis on livable neighborhoods, was to acknowledge how critical that is to achieving housing goals.
And then my other quick question, I don't know how you guys are getting into how this demand and supply sort of analysis works, because one thing that I've struggled with, just being here and then also being at this table, has been the term affordability, and that's sort of a blanket term for a multiple myriad of or a myriad of stakeholders. So if you think about the demand side, the research team here, as well as the fact I think the city has its own demographer, understanding the full range of incomes, I don't know if that's on an AMI basis, but taking a look at the population that exists today and the population as it grows, where are the bands of demand? And then trying to, and it's not a static model, because obviously this changes over time, but the demand side, and then what you guys are doing to think about the 200,000 of preserved and new housing in meeting those tranches. And again, the administration's been very thoughtful about talking about middle income and not just low income. But when you think about the whole range, what are you guys doing to try to match supply to the demand if you go up the need?
So one of the things we're doing is we're looking at data on rent burden from the housing vacancy survey that HPD produces every 2 years. And it doesn't turn out to be rocket science. It's that generally lower income households have higher levels of rent burden. And so that's where we're looking to target our subsidy. The other thing that constrains that analysis is that we have a specific finite set of tools for how we can finance housing. And based on federal rules and state rules, those financing sources target certain bands. So what we're looking at, which don't necessarily line up perfectly with demand. So what we're looking at doing is, again, with finite resources, we're trying to expand those subsidies to broaden the bands that we serve.
So said another way, you are thinking about, not just percentage-wise, but on a whole numbers basis, the different bands of income, and again, you can do that on an AMI basis, and how your policies, because there are some things just from a zoning, things that don't actually require subsidy from you, that can be supplied by the private sector, you are thinking about meeting those needs from the demand side at the various steps of the.
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
that's great.
Any further questions? Thank you so much. It was
Thank
really
you.
very
Thanks so
informative.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so in terms of any unfinished business we had, I don't know if there was a need to kind of bring some closure to the discussion that Harvey and Sarah were having, or whether that's something we can hold for another day. That's, and with respect to the question of how we address the obviously very challenging schedule that we have, particularly when looking at the combination of the public hearings and the way those are closely linked in time to the final public meeting, it seemed like where we left off was, again, our recommendation is that anyone who has a proposal, you will receive, in the fairly near future, but certainly before the first public hearing, a copy of the exact language that I read into the record that sets forth exactly where we need to sort of fill in our numbers, so everyone will have a chance to look at that carefully with plenty of time for reflection and to look at the data that's been provided to us and thinking about that. My sense is that the combination of the data that we've had presented to us and then the multiple opportunities we'll have for hearing from the public should give us enough information for there to be multiple presentations that reflect, the different considerations and the different perspectives that members of the board bring. And, back to Magna's concern that the Queen's hearing essentially is irrelevant because people will have had to essentially have thought through the proposals before that meeting. That's true, but because there are multiple proposals that will allow us each to sort of incorporate what we hear at each of the different public hearings into how we decide to vote, it strikes me that the Queen's hearing is still, the folks from Queens are not being somehow undermined in their ability to share what is, what's important to them. And I guess I would also suggest that there aren't that many numbers before us. So I am pretty confident that the different proposals that will come from different members of the board will be adequate for us to think through what we need to think through before June 23rd and when we actually vote, given that we will have some opportunity at the different public hearings to have discussion should discussion prove necessary. So again, I know this isn't ideal. This is a difficult year for all sorts of reasons, but it does strike me that we've had an enormous amount of information already presented to us, and then we will have the important opportunity to hear from both tenants and owners as individuals at the public hearings, and each of us can sort of individually and collectively at different points come to a conclusion about what we think the appropriate number ultimately is. So I'm not sure how, I don't know that there's a better way to proceed than the way that we've suggested that we proceed, which is anyone who would like to have some sort of discussion about the proposal among the full board in an open meeting about the proposal that they would are planning to make, please submit that to Andrew before, Andrew, what would be a time that would be necessary for you to be able to circulate it?
Like I said, it needs to be on the website and circulated by June 19th. The sooner I get it, the easier it is for me to do that, but we can do that on the 19th if we have to.
But I was also wondering, because neither Sarah nor Magna will be able to attend the Queen's meeting.
Oh, in terms of getting it there,
For
the 17th would be
Okay,
ideal.
okay.
If it's the morning of the 18th, I can handle that. But, to be at a hearing at 5 o'clock, we're, as staff, will be leaving probably by 3:30. So in order to circulate that and follow the law, I would need it. So really, ideally, the 17th would be.
And again, for legal purposes, it is fine for us to have multiple proposals, and we will number them. Proposal 1, Proposal 2, Proposal 3, Proposal 4. So we can have multiple proposals that allow us to consider multiple perspectives. That's fine. What we can't have is, sort of modifications made on the fly on June 23rd. That can't happen. If it does, we have to meet again. So in order to, and it seems to me that with this, the collective brain power of this group, we will be able to have enough proposals that take into account enough of the different permutations that I would think we'd be able to have a proposal that, we can vote upon and not have to tinker with on June 23rd, given that we have quite a bit of time between now and the 18th to think about each of the different components. And again, each of you will have all of the language, all of the different components of the numbers that we'll actually be voting on with plenty of time for reflection.
Nor can you take a piece of one proposal and it has to be.
It has, the
vote
vote,
has to be
in,
on one specific
yes,
proposal, as
Yes.
is.
Not no periods.
No.
That's right.
yes. So again, that's why so even, Magnet would be totally fine if you were, for example, to have two proposals. It's not as though any of us are limited to one proposal. So if you had two different ways of thinking through that would, sort of, in your mind, be important for the board to consider, that's fine.
I get that, but I just wanted to make sure that then on the 23rd, say, I thought something that the public members proposed was a good, or one aspect of it was good, and I wanted to combine it with something that the owner representatives had proposed. That could not happen.
That, if were that to happen and were that to be the proposal that ultimately, if it's, proposal 1 with half of proposal 5, we'd have to meet again in 3 days. So my suggestion would be as, and again, I hope we don't have 8,000 proposals because I think that's sort of silly, but as each of us evaluate the proposals that are circulated, I think we'll have to put some forethought into, sort of which component of the proposals seem most important and most thoughtful, and if when you see the array of proposals on June 19th, you're wrestling between one aspect of one, perhaps that Magna proposed, and one aspect of another the public member proposed, then before the 19th, submit, the proposal 1 with half of proposal 5 so that Andrew can put it on the website, and then we're fine.
So there's multiple rounds of this, and we can still make that. So as long as we give each other enough lead time.
Right.
So it's almost like having that dialogue, but sort of an iterative process.
And all prior to the 19th.
And all prior to the
So
19th.
That's great.
That's
Yes.
the key.
Yes.
Everybody has to do it,
Yes.
not on the 19th, but
But
prior to.
As long as we're meeting on the 18th, if you're talking about on the 18th, someone could submit something.
Absolutely, absolutely.
C.
Yes.
So that, I think, opens the idea that if this all breaks down, the 27th would be the date that I think we would meet if we had to, so.
But then you can't have a vote on the 28th, could you?
No. What would have to happen is, if this breaks down on the 23rd, which I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that it doesn't, we would then have to, if there's not a consensus on the 23rd around one of the proposals that's been previously submitted. 5 votes, sorry.
I love consensus.
No, I hate consensus, actually.
5
If there are
votes.
not 5 votes for one of the proposals that are submitted on the 19th, then we will have to submit a proposal on the 23rd that we would then have to vote on the 27th, in person, with a quorum. That one of the reasons why, I think we
Down on
should
the
do
27th.
everything in our power to make sure that we all
Okay.
put a great deal of forethought into this and work through whatever we have to work through to have a proposal on the table that will get 5 votes on the 23rd.
Because we have to have it on the book for July.
Yes.
Yes.
And the bylaws do say that you have to be in person in order to vote. We checked all this yesterday. No proxies.
Yeah, but that was before FaceTime.
You'd think you should be able to have, we should be able to Skype in, but we'll have to modify the bylaws for that. I don't think we have time before the 23rd. So it
This
is,
is the first year that we've had this.
yes.
Yes.
It was, the city council did not pass this in reflection, or in response to anything that we've done. It was passed in response to various other political machinations, and it is affecting us in a very unfortunate way.
If you read the law, it mentions other
Yes,
agencies.
it was triggered by others than us.
Yeah, I think from my discussions with the law department, we're the most affected by this in what we normally do. So, for what that's worth.
Any Any motion to adjourn? All in favor?
Aye.